Shadow Lounge was a classic, incredibly vivid, kind of primal Irish. It wasn't an Irish pub. It was just an old Irish bar for Irish people with Irish bartenders. And one of the first revelations, that's where I discovered how the Irish have this love for American country music. Because in the Shannon, they would alternate on the jukebox, they would alternate Irish and country music. And that was the policy. It was a strictly observed policy. So that was one thing I learned. I hadn't thought about this until you told me, you invited me to be on this podcast.
Welcome to this Behind Bars Network docuseries.
James T. Fisher is one of the few people who can talk about Hoboken from the jukebox out. He's a historian of the New York-New Jersey port, a longtime professor at Fordham University, and the author of On the Irish Waterfront, a book about how Irish mobsters, priests, and dock workers built and fought over the soul of the Port of New York. His work is less movie trivia and more X-ray. You get the corruption, the unions, the waterfront bar culture, and the quiet Jesuit campaign behind On the Waterfront, all in one frame. So when Fisher tells you about the shape-up, he's not defining a hiring system. He's pointing at the mechanism that made a whole neighborhood's economy and a lot of its bars run.
The shape-up was a system of hiring, a method of hiring dock workers. And of course, it all depended on how many ships were in the harbor and how many men were needed. So they always maintained a kind of a flexible labor supply. They needed workers on one day, didn't need them the other day. So there were classes or categories of dock workers. Some could count on regular work, most could not. And so they simply had to turn up in the hope that there were ships in the harbor that needed to be unloaded or loaded. And so that became known as the shape-up. And of course, it was rife to all kinds of corruption, kickback and bribes and all those things, so that people could try to work just to support their families. And so that became the basis of the waterfront economy. And of course, it became the basis, as your series has made so clear, of the local saloon or bar as the hiring hall, as the place to get information about jobs. That's why the bars were on the waterfront, because men needed to know in very short notice if there were jobs, and they would go line up for these jobs. So that was the shape-up. It was a system that, for Corydon, it symbolized the corruption of the whole hiring system and the economy.
In Fisher's book, the shape-up has a shadow. A Jesuit priest named John Pete Corydon. He's the one who dragged screenwriter Bud Schulberg down to the docks, helps turn kickbacks and casual labor into a script, and eventually shows up on screen as Father Barry, the conscience of On the Waterfront. The irony is that Corydon's reform agenda barely lands in real life. But the film lands everywhere. It wins Oscars, rewires how Americans think about unions, and freezes Hoboken's geography and class struggle in black and white.
But Tom, we come down River Street as you start to approach the area around St. Peter Paul. Then we would turn down the hill, and suddenly you can see the panorama, the way that Hoboken is terraced. There's the waterfront, and then there's the sort of the Palisades, the sort of little cliffs there, and you can just see how the visual tableau is a complete God's gift to the filmmakers. The Hoboken is really the star of the film, along with Marlon Brando. And of course, they didn't make much of the fact that it was shot in Hoboken. They really kind of always kept that quiet. But what makes the film is the visual richness that was made possible by Hoboken's topography and the geography and the physical infrastructure of the port. And the fact that they did it almost on the sly, and there was attempts to sabotage the shoot. Guys from other piers were throwing stuff onto the set, and then of course it became pretty controversial point. At the very same time that they're shooting this film in late 1953, there's a recertification election going on in which the union itself now is finally, because the International Longshoremen's Association was expelled from the AFL, the labor movement. And so, inspired by Corydon, they were able to get a new election to certify either the old union or the new union. And there's a campaign going on. There's a campaign going on at the very moment that this film is being shot. And this is something no one else had written about. When Johnny Friendly is punched into the river by Pop Doyle at the end of the scene right there on the pier, you can see in the background, the shot, there's a little rowboat in the river. And there's a sticker on it that says Rebel NY, right? It says Rebel NY. Should have said Rebel NY and NJ. Well, what they meant was this was a signal to like the dock workers, you know what I mean? Like vote for this new union. So the film was even kind of a campaign film, you know?
2 years after On the Waterfront comes out, a trucking company owner in North Carolina starts experimenting with standardized containers. Within a decade, that technology turns ports into steel and concrete puzzle boards. Fewer men on piers, more cranes and yards, and eventually almost no casual shape-up lines at all. Fisher likes to say that containerization didn't just kill off one kind of job, it wiped out an entire waterfront way of life from Jersey City to Hoboken. That's the world his dock worker at Seton Hall is measuring the film against when he calls it hype.
Years later, after the film was made, I gave a talk at Seton Hall, and a man came up to me at the end, and he was a Hoboken dock worker, and he looked at me and he said, you know, a lot of this was hype. You know, he said, this guy really didn't do that much for us, as he said, this priest. I'll never forget, wow, like, that was a heavy thing to hear after all that, you know what I mean? And there's always been that undercurrent. It's an incredibly powerful, it's like an Italian neo-realist film, you know, it has this incredibly visceral power that you rarely ever see in American films that treat political social issues. It generated a tremendous interest in the labor issues. In fact, 2 years after the movie was made, this guy in the Carolinas invents containerization technology. The next thing you know, there are hardly any more dock workers, and it's all automated. That's the story of what happened to Hoboken. It was the whole end of a way of life. Think about that. It's the end of an entire way of life on the Hudson River coast in Jersey City and Hoboken, and that's it. It's over. By the 60s and the 70s, it dwindled, and then it just disappeared completely. And that's what makes it a fascinating story.
I mean, a smattering of historic establishments throughout Hoboken, and particularly First Street. But what's left are condos, bike lanes, big glass boxes for people, more bike lanes, and almost no trace of the fact this used to be one of the choke points for people entering the United States of America. And that's the dissonance Fisher's reacting to. You can stand where shape-ups and union elections used to decide survival, and now it's $17 cocktails in a bike lane.
I'd see all these armies of partiers from suburban New Jersey, and I would always want to like walk through them and say, well, do you know what happened here like 50, 60 years ago? Do you know what it was like here? And of course, nobody gave a damn. But sometimes it feels sacrilegious to me, what Hoboken turned into. It feels a little bit of a mockery sometimes.
Oh, are you kidding me? It's absolutely mismanaged. They're literally taking the things that you used to move to Westfield for, you used to move to Livingston for, you used to move to Morristown for your bikes and your kids' soccer. Now you've destroyed Hoboken. And guess what? Your bike lanes kind of suck, and your kids are playing soccer with trucks going by 50 yards away. You still didn't create Livingston, but you absolutely destroyed Hoboken.
I mean, we went to Hoboken whenever we could. And then one time I was on my own, and I decided I wanted to go to the Clambroth. And when I got there, I didn't find it. I didn't see it. It's the Clambroth House. We used to call it the Clambroth. Yeah, the Clambroth House, the place where women were not allowed until the 1970s.
Piccolo's cheesesteaks?
Yeah.
Started as a Clambroth.
Well, there you go. See that? But the funny thing is, I'm not proud to say this, but it's just notable, I'll say. I never set foot in Maxwell's in all those years, even though I loved the Feelies, also those great bands, because I just wanted to hang out in the Clambroth House, because that's the thing to me, is the distinctiveness, the uniqueness, the total, utter uniqueness of the city of Hoboken, the life and the culture.
The Clambroth House is one of those places where you can see the old waterfront rules baked into the building. It opened around 1899 on Newark Street, originally as Cervantes Restaurant, and very quickly became a dockworker spot. Free clam broth, cheap plates, and a strict no women policy that lasted well into the 20th century. By that I mean the 1970s. Even after the restaurant closed and containerization emptied most of the piers, the hand-shaped Clambroth House sign kept pointing towards the river, a leftover from the area when you worked the docks, got paid, and crossed the street to drink and to eat. For Fisher, those bars aren't just color. They're how you feel what was lost when the waterfront economy disappeared.
The total, utter uniqueness of the city of Hoboken, the life and the culture of that community. But it's just Hoboken is a very, very dramatic setting for the kinds of change that we're describing.
You're correct. You're talking about a place that was literally a choke point for everyone who entered the country. So it got flavored with undiluted seasoning from whichever culture was dominant at the time. And you showed up when there were remnants from multiple different cultures still rooted deep and ingrained as what made Hoboken Hoboken. So for you to point out a change to Hoboken is a bit of a deeper cut than the average change to the average 1 mile square town is entirely appropriate.
This is really fun, man. I'll never forget Shannon. I'll never forget and they were pretty opinionated people in there. And of course, there was the Irish cause too, there's like Irish republicanism, it was like a live issue in Hoboken. And gosh, those were the days.
To promote your establishment or sponsor a series, email us at gm@behindbars.network. Again, that email is gm@behindbars.network. If you like us, please subscribe on the Behind Bars Network YouTube channel or Spotify.